The rain hammered down on the streets of Lagos like bullets against metal, and Adanna Okoro was already 20 minutes late for her shift at the hospital. She clutched her bag tighter, her nurse's uniform slightly damp beneath her raincoat as she navigated through the evening chaos of Victoria Island. The storm had driven most people indoors, leaving the streets unusually quiet, almost eerie. That's when she heard it. A small, frightened whimper coming from the narrow alley between two luxury apartment buildings. Adanna's instincts kicked in immediately. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 6 years, and she knew the sound of a terrified child when she heard one. Against every logical bone in her body telling her to keep moving, to mind her business in a city where minding your business kept you alive, she turned into that alley. What she found made her heart stop. A little boy no older than 7, huddled behind a dumpster. His designer clothes torn and muddied, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. But it wasn't his injuries that froze her in place. It was the 3 men advancing toward him, their intentions written clearly in their predatory movements. The boy's eyes met hers, dark and wide with terror, and something ancient and protective roared to life in Adanna's chest. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She simply moved. In one fluid motion, she positioned herself between the child and the men, her 5'6" frame suddenly feeling both inadequate and immovable. The lead man, scarred and smelling of cigarettes, laughed, a sound like gravel scraping glass. He said something in Korean, words she didn't understand, but the threat was universal. Adanna's hand slipped into her bag, fingers wrapping around the pepper spray her brother had insisted she carry. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite the earthquake in her chest. She told them in English, then Igbo, then broken pidgin that they would have to go through her first. What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt like hours. The scarred man lunged. Adanna sprayed. He screamed. The other 2 moved forward, and she grabbed the boy, pulling him behind her as she backed toward the alley entrance, her phone now in her other hand, threatening to call the police. The men exchanged glances, something shifting in their expressions. Not fear but calculation. One of them spoke rapidly into a phone. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they retreated into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of a promise that this wasn't over. Adanna didn't waste time questioning her luck. She scooped up the trembling child and ran, her feet pounding against wet pavement until she reached the main road, flagging down the first taxi she saw. The boy hadn't spoken a word, just clung to her with a grip that spoke of nightmares and narrow escapes. As the taxi pulled away, Adanna caught sight of a black SUV sliding into traffic behind them, keeping pace. Her heart hammered. She just made either the best decision of her life or the worst mistake. The boy looked up at her then, and whispered 2 words in accented English that would change everything. "Thank you." Adanna's small apartment in Surulere had never felt more like a fortress and a trap at the same time. She'd cleaned and bandaged the boy's wounds, her nurse training taking over even as her mind raced with questions. He'd told her his name was Miho, and that he'd gotten separated from his father. The way he said father carried weight, the kind of weight that came with power and danger. She tried calling the police, but something in Miho's panicked reaction stopped her. Pure terror that went beyond normal childhood fear. So instead she'd made him rice and stew, watched him eat like he hadn't seen food in days, and waited for the knock on her door she knew was coming. Came at midnight. Not a knock, a presence. Adanna felt it before she heard it, that shift in the air that screamed danger. She moved to the window, peering through the curtain to see 3 black SUVs parked on her street, completely out of place in her working-class neighborhood. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with military precision. And then he stepped out of the center vehicle, and Adanna's breath caught in her throat. Tall, easily 6 feet, with sharp features that could have been carved from marble, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent. His hair was dark, styled back, and even from her second-floor window, she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This was a man who commanded empires, who made people disappear with a word. The knock when it came was polite, almost gentle. Adanna's hand shook as she checked that Miho was still asleep in her bedroom before approaching the door. She opened it with the chain still attached, her pepper spray in her pocket, and found herself staring into the most intense gaze she'd ever encountered. The man spoke, his English perfect but accented with Korean formality. He introduced himself as Kong Jaewon, and he was looking for his son. The words were simple, but the undercurrent was complex. Gratitude, threat, assessment, all swirling in that deep voice. He knew she had Miho. The question was what she wanted for his return. Adanna's Nigerian blood, the same blood that had survived colonization and civil war and decades of resilience, rose to meet his intensity. She told him, chain still on the door, that she wanted nothing except to know that the child would be safe. That those men in the alley wouldn't come back. That whatever world Jaewon lived in, Miho deserved better than running scared in the rain. She watched something flicker across Jaewon's face. Surprise, perhaps, or respect, or something more dangerous. He asked to see his son, and Adanna, against every instinct screaming at her to maintain the barrier, unlatched the chain. The moment Jaewon entered her modest apartment, the space transformed. He seemed to fill it, not just with his physical presence but with an energy that crackled like static before lightning. He moved past her toward the bedroom where Miho slept, and Adanna followed, watching as this cold, dangerous man's entire demeanor shattered at the sight of his child. Jaewon knelt beside the bed, his hand trembling as he brushed hair from Miho's forehead, and Adanna saw the truth. Underneath the power and the violence and the empire, here was a father who'd thought he'd lost his son. When Jaewon looked back at her, his eyes were different, still guarded, still calculating, but now with a warmth that felt like the sun breaking through storm clouds. He asked her name, really asked, like it mattered, like she mattered. And when Adanna answered, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the beginning of something that would either save her or destroy her. 3 days later, Adanna's life had become unrecognizable. Jaewon had insisted on protection. Bodyguards that followed her to work, armored cars that waited outside the hospital, a security system installed in her apartment that looked like it belonged in a government facility. Her colleagues whispered. Her family called with questions she couldn't answer. And through it all, Jaewon appeared like clockwork, always in the evening, always with Miho, the boy who'd become attached to her with the fierce loyalty of someone who'd found an unexpected hero. But it was Jaewon who unsettled her most. The way his eyes followed her movements, the way conversation between them had shifted from transactional to personal, the way her heart betrayed her every time he smiled. The truth came out over dinner at Jaewon's compound, a massive estate in Ikoyi that screamed wealth and danger in equal measure. Miho had begged for Adanna to join them, and she'd agreed, telling herself it was for the boy's sake. But as she sat across from Jaewon, watching candlelight play across his features, she knew she was lying to herself. He told her everything that night. About his family's organization, about the Korean syndicate that had roots in Seoul and branches across the world, including Lagos. About the rivals who'd tried to kidnap Miho as leverage. About the life he'd never chosen but had been born into, the violence he'd committed to survive, the empire he'd built to protect what was his. He laid it bare, waiting for her judgment, for her to run. Adanna should have run. Every rational thought told her to walk away from this beautiful, dangerous man and his world of shadows. But instead she found herself talking, sharing her own story. About growing up in Enugu, about losing her mother to preventable illness because they couldn't afford proper health care, about becoming a nurse to save others from that fate. About her brother who joined the wrong crowd and paid with his life. About understanding that the world wasn't divided into simple good and evil, but into people trying to survive and protect what they loved. She watched Jaewon's expression shift as she spoke, saw recognition there. Two people from different worlds who understood the same fundamental truth about sacrifice and survival. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger. Jaewon reached across the table, his hand covering hers, and the touch sent electricity racing up her arm. He told her she was remarkable, that he'd never met anyone who'd risk themselves for a stranger's child without asking for anything in return. That in his world kindness was currency, and she'd just bought something priceless, His loyalty, his protection, and if she wanted it, his heart. Adanna's breath caught. She was falling, had already fallen, and the landing was going to either be soft or catastrophic. But before she could respond, before she could voice the feelings tangling in her chest, chaos erupted. Glass shattered. Alarms screamed. Men in masks poured through windows and doors with military precision. Jaiwan moved instantly, pushing Adanna behind him, his entire demeanor shifting from vulnerable to lethal in a heartbeat. He barked orders in Korean, his hand producing a gun from somewhere Adanna hadn't seen. This was the other Jaiwan, the one who commanded criminal empires, and she should have been terrified. Instead, as gunfire erupted and he shielded her body with his own, all she felt was trust. His security team engaged the attackers, the compound transforming into a war zone. Jaiwan dragged her toward a panic room, Miho already being carried there by a bodyguard, and in that moment of violence and protection, Adanna understood. She was already part of this world, had been since the moment she'd stepped into that alley. The question wasn't whether to stay, it was whether she had the strength to survive it. The attack had failed, but its message was clear. Jaiwan's enemies knew about Adanna, and she'd become a target. As dawn broke over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for the violence of the previous night, Jaiwan made her an offer. Leave Nigeria with him and Miho, relocate to Seoul where his power was absolute, where he could protect her properly. Or walk away now, accept enough money to start over anywhere, and forget this chapter of her life ever happened. He delivered it without emotion, but Adanna had learned to read the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched when he was fighting feelings he didn't want to acknowledge. He was giving her an out, even though it would destroy him. Adanna stood at the window of the safe house where they'd spent the night, looking out at the city she'd called home for 30 years. Lagos, with all its chaos and beauty, its frustration and opportunity. Her family was here. Her career was here. The life she'd built brick by brick, shift by shift, was here. But as she felt Jaiwan's presence behind her, felt the weight of Miho's small hand slipping into hers, the boy had sought her out, always did now when he was scared. She realized home had started to mean something different. She turned to face Jaiwan, seeing past the armor to the man underneath, the one who read bedtime stories to his son in a mix of Korean and English, who'd spent an hour last week asking about her work with genuine interest, who looked at her like she was the miracle in a life defined by darkness. Her answer came not in words but in action. She crossed the space between them, rose on her toes and kissed him. It was bold, perhaps foolish, definitely dangerous, but it was real. For a moment, Jaiwan froze, shocked, and then he responded with an intensity that stole her breath. His hands cupped her face like she was precious, breakable, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promise and desperation and need. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adanna whispered against his lips that she'd made her choice. She was staying not just because of Miho, not just because of the danger, but because somewhere between that rainy alley and this moment, she'd fallen in love with a man who was both monster and protector, criminal and father, dangerous and hers. But love, Adanna was learning, came with complications. Jaiwan's second-in-command, a sharp-eyed woman named Yuna, pulled her aside later that day with brutal honesty. The Korean syndicate had rules, hierarchies, expectations. Jaiwan's position meant everything, and an outsider, especially one with no connection to their world, no family ties, no leverage, was a weakness they couldn't afford. Some in the organization would see Adanna as a liability to be eliminated. Others would test her, push her, try to prove she wasn't worthy. And if she stayed, if she truly committed to this path, she'd need to be more than Jaiwan's lover. She'd need to be his partner, someone who understood the game and could play it without losing herself. Yuna's eyes held challenge and assessment in equal measure as she asked Adanna point-blank if she was prepared for that reality. The old Adanna, the one who'd existed just days ago, would have faltered. But the woman standing in this safe house, who'd stared down kidnappers and survived an assault, who'd seen the man she loved transform into a warrior to protect her, was different. She met Yuna's gaze steadily and told her she'd survived Lagos, The traffic, the chaos, the hustle, the disappointments, the small victories. She'd built a career in a system that tried to break her. Had protected patients when administrators cared more about money than lives. Had lost family to violence and kept going. If they wanted to test her, let them try. She was Nigerian. Resilience was in her DNA. Yuna studied her for a long moment, then smiled. A real smile, sharp and approving, and told her she might just survive after all. 6 months later, Adanna stood on the balcony of Jaiwan's Seoul penthouse, looking out at a city that had become unexpectedly familiar. The transition hadn't been easy. Learning Korean, navigating the complex politics of Jaiwan's organization, dealing with threats both subtle and overt. There'd been a particularly nasty incident with a rival faction that had left her with a scar on her shoulder and a reputation for being tougher than she looked. She'd also discovered she had a talent for the strategic side of Jaiwan's business, her nursing background translating surprisingly well to risk assessment and crisis management. She'd become invaluable, not just as Jaiwan's partner but as a voice of reason in a world that often lacked it. But it was the small moments that had truly transformed her life. Miho calling her Adanna, a blend of her name and the Korean word for mother, the first time it happened making her cry in the bathroom for 20 minutes. Jaiwan's morning ritual of making her Nigerian-style tea because he'd learned how from a YouTube video and was determined to get it right. The way his organization had slowly accepted her, particularly after she'd saved one of their own using her medical skills during an emergency. The nights when she and Jaiwan would lie tangled together, talking about everything and nothing. His fingers tracing patterns on her skin while she planned how to expand her healthcare advocacy work in Korea. Tonight was different though. Jaiwan had been tense all day, distracted during meetings, unusually quiet. Adanna knew him well enough now to recognize when something was brewing. She'd learned patience, had learned that in this world, information came when it was time. So she waited, watching Seoul's lights twinkle like earthbound stars, until she felt his arms wrap around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. He told her, voice rough with emotion, that he'd made arrangements, that he wanted to marry her properly, with ceremonies in both Korea and Nigeria, that he wanted to legitimize his businesses, use his resources to fund the healthcare initiatives she'd been passionate about. That meeting her had reminded him that power could be used for more than just survival, it could be used for good. But there was a catch, there was always a catch in their world. The transition out of the darker aspects of his empire would take time and would make him vulnerable. His enemies would see it as weakness, would strike when they sensed opportunity. The next year would be the most dangerous of their lives, requiring strategy and strength and sacrifice. He turned her around to face him, his eyes, those intense, dark eyes that had first assessed her as a threat and now looked at her like she was salvation, searching hers. He asked if she was ready for that fight, if she'd stand beside him not just in love but in war, if she trusted him enough to bet everything on the future they could build together. Adanna thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, running through the rain to a nursing shift, her life predictable and safe and small. She thought about the moment she'd heard a child crying in an alley and made a choice that had seemed simple then but had been anything but. She thought about all the ways love could transform you, challenge you, remake you into someone stronger than you'd ever imagined. She looked at Jaiwan, this beautiful, complicated, dangerous, devoted man, and then at Miho visible through the window, doing homework at the dining table, the child who'd become hers in every way that mattered. Her family in Nigeria had been skeptical at first but had come around, especially after Jaiwan had funded a new clinic in Enugu in her mother's name. Her world had exploded and reformed into something unrecognizable and somehow more real than anything she'd known before. She answered him the way she'd answered every challenge since that rainy night, with courage and certainty and a stubborn refusal to back down. She told him yes. Yes to the danger, yes to the transformation, yes to building something new from the ashes of what they'd been before. Yes to mornings and midnights, to Seoul and Lagos, to love that was messy and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. Jaiwan kissed her then, deep and claiming, a promise sealed with breath and heat. When they broke apart, he produced a ring, a stunning piece that blended Korean and Nigerian design elements, a physical representation of their merged worlds, and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like everything about them that shouldn't work but somehow did. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and dangerous and beautiful. There would be more fights, more threats, more nights when they'd have to be warriors instead of lovers. But there would also be Miho's graduation someday. Clinics built, lives saved, a family forged not from blood but from choice. Adanna had learned that protection came in many forms. Sometimes it was standing in an alley against impossible odds. Sometimes it was choosing love despite every logical reason not to. Sometimes it was simply showing up every day ready to fight for what mattered. She'd protected a child she didn't know and gained a family she'd never expected. In the end, that rainy night in Lagos hadn't been the wrong place at all. It had been exactly where she was meant to be. The beginning of a story that was still being written, one dramatic chapter at a time. And as she stood there, ring glinting on her finger, Jaiwan's arms around her, Miho's laughter drifting from inside, Adanna knew with absolute certainty that she'd make the same choice again. Every single time. If you loved Adanna and Jaiwan's story, subscribe for more emotional romance dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Drop a comment telling us what you'd do if you were in Adanna's shoes. Would you have stepped into that alley? Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next heart-pounding story.